Hi, I'm Hans Linier, your EMEA evangelist for Veeam Software, and today I am joined by Mike Laverick. Mike, good afternoon. We're here in Italy, in Milan, for a VMUG Italy. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who is Mike Laverick?
Mike Laverick was an instructor and has been an instructor for a very long time, and in the kind of 2003-2004 period I got interested in this company called VMware, interested in this thing called virtualization, and I thought, that looks pretty cool. I'll invest a lot of my time and effort into this thing, not really knowing whether I was going to make a shekel out of it. And kind of weird thing about getting into, I know there are people who got into VMware earlier than me, so I don't want to overact this, but I think that's quite early, is that when you get involved in a technology early, it's like being on an escalator. Like, you just do what you normally do, but you rise and rise and rise with that escalator because you rise with that growing market. So by the end of that kind of decade, I guess, I'd written 4 or 5 books on ESX2, VI3 as it was called back then, vSphere 4, 3 books on Site Recovery Manager, 2 books on VMware View. It was kind of weird actually. I think from 2003 2004, I basically just solidly wrote for 6 or 7 years without stopping, with about a 6-week break in between.
Do you have a copy of all the books?
I do actually.
At least one?
I've got a copy of every single one, even the ones in Spanish, because there was somebody who translated one of my SRM books into Spanish, which is really weird because I was like, and you write in Spanish as well? Get out of town. And it's like, well, it's not me, it's a friend of mine who translated it. So some of those were self-published and some of those were done through publishers. But my main kind of thing I was an instructor. That's what I did up until about 2009. And then I had an opportunity to sell my blog, RTFM Education.
You had a really famous blog.
I did. Had a good name. Everybody remembered RTFM for obvious reasons. So I sold the blog to a media company in Boston called Tech Target. I worked for them for a while, kind of moonlighted as a journalist, I guess, for a while.
Are you still involved?
With Tech Target?
With the RTFM blog?
I think what's happened with RTFM is shortly after I joined VMware, Tech Target took the decision to redirect the domain to their website. So as a domain, rtfm-ed.co.uk, it doesn't exist anymore. The weird thing about that is when I met the lady who was sort of in charge of that process, she said to me, I never realised that how popular your site was. And I said, why do you say that? I said, well, it now contributes in excess of 60% of the traffic into our website since the DNS redirect, or some kind of figure like that, don't quote me on the percentages. So, yeah, and the opportunity to join VMware came up, and I guess after really nearly a decade of working solidly with their technologies, it was the sort of natural step to cross over to the dark.
Yeah, so once you got rich and sold your blog, and you've sold millions of copies of your books,
yeah.
And now you just took... you went to the vendor, you went to the dark side, you joined VMware.
Yes, I did. I mean, just to point out that obviously when you sell a blog and sell loads of books, I mean, it's like being J.K. Rowling or, Dan Brown, limousines pull up outside the hotel rooms to whisk you away. It's to be honest with you, I would have thought actually the books and the blog, I wouldn't say lost money on those, but if you actually sat down and calculated how much money you made out of it, you wouldn't do it. It's a bit like doing a PhD. If you did a PhD and you sat down the time and effort you put into a PhD and the benefits at the end, you might scratch your chin and think, is this the same thing for me to do? But the reason to write a book isn't because you're going to make money, it's because you're absolutely...
You want to share knowledge.
Well, it's not. It just comes out of you. Like any writer, even if it's a writer of fiction. Mm-hmm. If you're a writer of fiction, it's the air you breathe, you can't help but write. It's kind of weird. But anyway.
Okay. So what do you do now at VMware?
I'm VMware's senior cloud infrastructure evangelist. And you've heard the gags before.
I know.
But I'm going to repeat them on camera anyway, which is I've met no junior cloud infrastructure evangelist yet that I can boss around, make cups of tea for me. And the role of an evangelist, as we both know, is to stare blankly into people's faces, glazed, so everything that the vendor does is wonderful and great, and you should buy our software. And it'll be a little bit scary, like you've been brainwashed. That's the role of an evangelist in these companies.
But we meet again.
We meet again
for the X time in a few months.
Yeah.
I think we can actually call you Mr. VMUG officially. I know that you're not. It's not your role to do all VMUGs, but
No.
like me, I actually do as much as I can. And what I'm interested in is your point of why do we do these VMUGs as a company, as a person? Why do we travel that much to go to at each and every VMUG? Why do we like that so much?
It's funny, Mr. VMUG, that would be a great domain name. MrVMUG.com. But anyway, that's an aside. I think there's a couple of answers to that question. Before I joined VMware, I did VMUG events essentially for free in the US. The expenses were covered, and I'd often spend a couple of days with a vendor to justify the trip out of there. But it was kind of shameless self-promotion, I have to admit to that. As a freelancer and as somebody who's trying to build my reputation in the industry, the opportunity to go to the US once a month and talk to a big group of people and actually have a physical presence in the US was really valuable to me. And I think the other benefit of that is up until doing those big user events, I'd not spoken to audiences that were 500, 600, 800, 1,000. The groups I'd spoken to were 12, who it was a classroom, or 20, 30, 40, 50.
Because you were a teacher.
Yeah, and there is a skill to be learned. And when I went for this role at VMware, I kind of said to them, well, I've been the unofficial evangelist, the unpaid evangelist for 18 months. And I've got an 18 months apprenticeship on standing up and speaking to people. If you want to see what I can do, just come along to the Silicon Valley VMUG and I'll show you that, the Mike Laverick style. But there is that aspect of career thing, but now with VMware, obviously I have to sort of think of it more like, well, the VMware hat kind of on it. So there is this sort of getting the message out to people about what it is that we do. I see my job is trying to communicate that in a way that dispenses with the normal methods that companies use to communicate. And I'm not just talking about social media, Twitter and all that kind of stuff. I'm talking about the language and the terminologies that a lot of companies use. If you're a technical person like I am, I think I'm kind of technical, I used to be, all that talk of return of investment and total cost of ownership and
buzzword bingo.
You heard me at the Eindhoven VMUG take the P out of flexible, on-demand, elastic cloud hybrid infrastructures, and just trying to peel away all that kind of marketing speak and just say it. I think the big thing is if you're going to speak at a VMUG, and you do this as well, is the more you can be yourself and not some kind of chimera of a corporate PowerPoint, the more you connect with your audience.
Exactly.
In fact, that corporate veneer, I feel that a user group event can sort of get in the way of actually communicating. But we were saying offline, and we were discussing offline, I think my expectations of what VMUGs were back in 2003 and what they sometimes are is I expected it to be a bunch of people who got around and said, oh, we've had this really difficult problem with VMware software or Veeam software, and this is how we fixed it, or this is how we did the design. But that doesn't happen very much, and I think that's a great shame, and I would like to see both in the
Birds of a feather.
Yeah, in the VMware user groups, or in all user groups, to make sure that the focus stays on the user, the customer using the product. Yes, we need the sponsors. Nothing is for free.
Well, and on the other part, because I've been involved with some organizations of a VMUG, customers are not always that forthcoming to say, oh, you know what, let me show you what we do in our environment. And it's not that easy to drive them to give their own shows.
So how do you think you get over that barrier if they're not particularly forthcoming? Or?
Well, I think that's more one of the things that the organizers of VMUGs need to look at. Who is coming back every VMUG, every event from local people, and start talking to them and asking them, what's your environment like? What is a challenge you had last year? And maybe, do you want to talk about that next time? Because exactly, that's the same thing that I feel a little if we go to VMUGs, is that we miss the actual user presenting its case. Most of the time we do have our own, because you are VMware and I'm Veeam, we do our own presentations. We want them to be a technical presentation, because that's what they like. But we miss a little bit of that coming back communication, which makes it more of a vendor user group.
Than it could be. There's a couple of things to say about that. I think another option, rather than being technical, is doing a kind of thought piece, your own personal thoughts about a particular aspect of what we're doing in the industry. So it doesn't need necessarily be about radio buttons or tick-off boxes or anything. That could be about your own why are we doing, what's our direction of the industry just generally. One thing I've always said to VMUG leaders, because I formerly was a member of the London user group steering committee, so I know what it's like to put these events on, but I must admit I never did any of the hard work. I just used to do the telecoms, and then turn up and speak sometimes. But what they did at the London user group, which I think worked well, was saying to people, the slot time is only half an hour, not 45 minutes or an hour. First 5 or 10 minutes is your intro, the outro is any questions. And therefore you're really only asking that person to speak really solidly for 15 or 20 minutes. And I think that doesn't lower the bar, but it takes away the fear factor associated with getting in front of people and speaking. Because I think, whether we like it or not, as IT people, the more technical you are, the general rule is the less comfortable you feel
about speaking.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't want to make any sweeping statements, but I think that's probably generally well-held view. Whereas if you work in the marketing and the PR side of things of IT, if you have problems speaking in public, then maybe you should be thinking of a different career. But it's not from a technical point of view, getting technical people to present, I think, is a little bit tricky. I think occasionally we're guilty of people hiding behind of what my company would never let me say. And I've run a podcast for years where I said, just don't mention your company name. Just say I work for a big financial institution. Let's talk about what you do. And nobody's ever pulled me up on that. No member of staff has ever been pulled up on that. It's just been, as soon as you mention company name, that's when it starts to get tricky, I think. But as long as you keep that out of the frame, I think you're all right.
Well, that comes to maybe a next question. As being now a vendor evangelist like me, how hard is it for us? And I'm asking you now. I know how hard it is for me sometimes to be the indie guy we were less than a year ago. We were indie bloggers. We could say anything we want. Can we still say anything we want? Do we do that?
I think.
How hard is it?
I think I wouldn't say it's hard, it's tricky. I think it's something you have to have in the back of your mind, because the danger is, if you've been independent for as long as I have, 10 or 11 years, I stopped being Mike Laverick Limited on a Friday and became VMware Senior Cloud Infrastructure on the Monday. But nothing really materially changed about my life. I still got up and, potted down in my dressing gown, switched on the computer, sat with a cup of coffee and went through my email and started blogging. It wasn't like a radically different experience where I was driving to work and swiping myself through a building, where there was obviously this sense of change, where psychologically, culturally, suddenly and the danger there was writing something or tweeting something which would be perhaps innocent or naive done as an independent, but could be picked up by one of your competitors and used against you, without you even realising that it could be used that way. It's a bit like politicians and the media. A politician says something which they think is completely innocent, and then within 24 hours, the opposition has diced it and sliced it so it means something else.
You're on the front page.
Yeah, the media is, and like the politician was like, all I said was, but now his career is over. Yeah. So I think I think we have a responsibility to our colleagues, because we're in a very public role, not to fall into the situation of opening one's mouth and then inserting one's foot in it. And because it doesn't just reflect badly on you as an individual, it reflects badly on the company. To this particular question, there's things I want to write now which I wouldn't have ever written when I was an independent, because I was an independent. But I want to write now, but I can't put on my personal blog.
Okay.
So what I'm thinking of doing, I need to speak to my manager about this, is actually having an internal, Mike Laverick internals blog, where I can freely say what I like, but it's for my colleagues to read.
Internal use only.
Yeah. And
because you don't want to set that foot where it doesn't have to be in public.
Well, for example, I might want to say something very, very critical of a competitor, and that will like really tear the shreds off them and pull away the kimono. But I think when people come to mikelaverick.com, they're not coming to hear me have a go at a competitor and go negative. Yeah. And not that I would go negative on an internal blog, but obviously you're competing against people, and when you're competing against people, you look for where they're weak. When you fight, when you're in a team playing against another team, you don't play against the hardest members of that team. You find their weak spots. You find the gap through their defence where they're not strong in midfield. well, that isn't to be sharing with them, so they know where their vulnerabilities are. Like if I was playing for Liverpool, I wouldn't put on Liverpool's blog what our strategy is for playing Man United on Saturday. That would be like giving them the ball. So but I would never have written that when I was independent, because what Microsoft was doing with VMware or what VMware was doing with Oracle, I didn't care. But I wasn't really interested. It's not.
I've always looked about that at the same way. I've always wanted to be a positive writer, as in if something was out there that I didn't like, as in the technology, it was like, why would I waste my time in writing about it?
If you haven't got anything good to say, don't say anything at all.
Yes, exactly. And it's still the same thing working now for a vendor. If I don't have anything good to say about my own products, I just wouldn't matter saying it.
I think I try to be a modest person, and I believe I'm a modest person. But if you meet any evangelists, they usually have an ego which is so large they need double doors to get their head out of the door. So I mean, it's not being an evangelist is not a shrinking violet kind of role, really. But I try to be modest because it's a thing in British culture that people who put themselves on a pedestal and think they're better than anybody else, the next thing everybody does is try and drag them off that. And it's not a pleasant experience to be in. But I'm writing some stuff about vCloud Director at the moment, and the way I'm framing it is, it's not a fault in the product, it's a fault in me. That I looked at a particular feature and misunderstood what that feature was, and then carried on trying to impose my idea of how that feature should work, which was actually completely at odds with the design. Yeah. And the analogy I'm using for this, much though I dislike the woman, is Margaret Thatcher's comment that you can't buck the market. Because what I wanted the product to do X because that's what I thought the product should do. But the product has been written and designed in this way, and you can't buck the product. If the product's designed in this way, either the product gets redesigned, or you get into a lot of pain as you try and make a product do something it was never designed for. Something I've spoken at length at of VMworld, which is never use a hammer to do the work of a spanner. Never try and make a technology do something that it was never designed for. And the weird thing when we do that is go, isn't that a terrible design? The fact that I tried to get the nut off that wheel with a big sledgehammer, what a bad design that was. The man with the sledgehammer trying to, It's not the man with the sledgehammer's fault, of course. Never me, not mine. So which I think is a good display of my modesty, because I decided to write this piece. I could have written it as a kind of, why do we do it this way? This is stupid. I've done it more in...
why did I do it that way?
Why did I do it that way?
What's the mistake?
Why did I impose my frame of reference on this thing, which, looking back on it, I probably misunderstood this particular attribute of the product. And the more I look at it, the more I go, yeah, it was me.
So the tip in this is, keep it simple, but if you can't keep it simple, let Mike blog about it.
It's funny, actually, the V-Suit guys were having a little dig at me a couple of days ago. They were going on about my 60-second vCloud Director post. I've got this ongoing Nordic saga of vCloud Director, and they said, oh, it must be really complicated. He's on to like post 62. So I tweeted one of the guys, oh, I'm going up to 1,001 posts, so I won't stop until I get there. But I made a joke, I made a point is that I've written more about vSphere and ESX and Virtual Center and View and SRM than I've written about vCloud Director, but nobody said, oh, well, it looks complicated because you're writing a lot about it. Yeah. So I guess it's just that thing, one person's complexity is another person's sophisticatedness. It's a sophisticated product with lots of options and features and design issues. Other people want products where you just go next, but then people say, well, that's inflexible.
Or at least easy to use.
Yeah, that's inflexible because they only allow it to be configured in one particular way. And it's funny how we do that as technical people. A product's made, and as soon as you install it, you start thinking, why can't it do this? Or why would it do that? And I think that's a great thing in our community, and you'll see this at the VMUGs, is there's always that burning desire within the people who use the products to make it better, which, in some industries, I don't want to name any, but there's a great deal of, well, it's always been this way, and that design's worked good for us. And
I think we still see that a lot in our industry too.
Yeah, there is like best practices that never change. Yeah.
Keep it simple, and make it easy to use. Mike, thank you very much for this interview.
You're welcome.
I always have to find a way to stop you talking. I hear the Italians coming in, I think we're off for dinner. Thank you very much for this interview, and we'll meet each other at a lot of next VMUGs to come.
Next VMUGs to come.